Okay, thank you for coming today. So my talk is going to be about another issue that was basically totally uncontested until a few years ago, but in recent time has come up as another issue that shares a lot of similarities with what Rotten now just explained, namely the issue of forced labor, forced relocation, and the question of whether it was forced and to what degree it was forced. Rodham just explained there is a big difference between what historians do and what politicians, diplomats, and other people make out of it. Most of you probably know this, and I mean, it's kind of a waste of time. But it's important to keep in mind how uncontested the issue of forced labor was. And still is among historians. In Japan, there's no historian, no serious historian at least, who would say there was no forced labor in Imperial Japan, or there was no forced relocation of people from one part of Japan to another part of Japan, meaning the Japanese Empire, which included, of course, Korea, Sakhalin, Okinawa, some Pacific islands and whatnot. And this was part of a larger plan. The general idea was to win the war, right? I mean, even that sounds, I read that in one book and it was like, oh yeah, right, of course, right? The government would like to win the war. And now, because we know the outcome, we are sometimes not thinking in that kind of pattern. But in 1938, 39, the Japanese government was still very optimistic. And they said, okay, we need to fix a few things, but then we're going to win the war. And one of those things was resources, including material resources, and what we today call human resources. Terrible term, but anyway. So the Japanese government decided that human resources have to be reallocated within the Japanese islands, within the Japanese empire, and people who did not usually work in a sense like industrial labor or construction labor until then were also made to work, namely women. So in World War II, women, I think in the last years, were mobilized to a very high degree to work in usually factories, not construction work, not mining. So there was another problem, right? You didn't have enough people to work in the construction industry, in mines, and that was then covered at one point, and was an increasing tendency, by bringing people from other parts of the empire to other parts of the empire, not only from Korea to Japan, which is today the most contested issue, but Koreans were also brought to Sakhalin, Koreans were brought to the Nanyo Islands and whatnot. And I mean, this was a totally normal thing to do. If you want to win a war, you reallocate people from industrial sectors to other industrial sectors. You mobilize people who don't work yet. You reallocate people from one area where you have less industry to another where you have more industry. And yeah, I mean, historians are pretty, nobody denies this, right? We even by now know the details. I'm sorry, but I skipped the details of this because we really all know this, and some of our colleagues, most recently, Professor Hatano Sumio has written about this. Before this, we had a great book by Professor Sotomura, 10, 20 years ago. And in these books, we have all of the details and all of the historical background. We also know, of course, that there were different stages. So if we speak about forced labor, we do not necessarily mean that people were running around in Korea, arresting people, putting them in chains and bringing them on ships to Japan. But there was a difference in terms of how people were recruited. The first stage was called the Boshu in 1939. And probably some of you have applied for jobs, right? And then you have looked at the Boshu, at the job advertisement. And of course, there's nothing particularly violent about that. You apply for a job because you want to do it. That was not exactly what happened in 1939, although the term at the time was Boshu, but Boshu was already a plan of a larger labor mobilization plan, the Romudo Inkeikaku, which had numbers. And for example, for Korea, the number, even in the first year, was, I think it was about 80,000, which of course means if you want to have 80,000 people relocating from Korea to Japan to work in Japan, and they're not coming, then, right, then there is some violence and some forced element involved. In the first years, actually, more Koreans went to Japan to work and to settle there outside of these plans, which is kind of interesting. So Koreans were not uninterested in working in Japan. That's also a misunderstanding that today the denialists make. They say, well, the Koreans, they were greedy and Korea was poor, so they wanted to go to Japan. But the plans, the labor mobilization plans, were never really fulfilled. So the numbers within the system were not filled. And that's why in the following years, 1943, 44 in particular, Japan stepped up its efforts in terms of labor mobilization. It introduced in 1943 a new system called kan-assen, kan coming from kanyo, from bureaucracy or the state authorities. And kan-assen might sound like, like a job center, maybe job mediation, right? But it wasn't that. It was much more direct involvement on the side of the authorities to make people move to Japan and work where there was not enough of a labor force. And 1943, 44, of course, I don't need to mention that. The Japanese men were all conscripted for war, right? So people were going to the front and you had to fill these empty slots of labor in Japan. That's why the numbers massively increased after 1943. And right after this kan-assen system, the labor recruitment or labor conscription, the choyo system, was introduced. And that is also something that is today very much debated due to some requests from Koreans for compensation. That's why it has been recently coming up. But just the fact that it has been coming up as a legal issue and a political issue does not mean that it became less true, right? Because that is kind of how today, that's the logic behind some political statements, right? But as I said, we know all of this, and we all also know from the contemporary sources. It's not very difficult. In the 1940s, there was a journal, a magazine published frequently with the title Chosen Rodo, Korean Labor. That was a specialized journal only discussing Korean labor. So obviously there was something about Korean labor in the Japanese Empire. There were also books and reports about Chosenji Nodo Shamondai, the problem of Korean laborers, right? I mean, this book exists. It is a historical source, and obviously it discusses the problems with Korean laborers, which were amongst others had to do with discrimination and also with the fact that the Koreans had to fill the slots that were the hardest labor. So what we're talking about here is mostly mining, construction work, not so much factories, because the women were working in the factories. So it was construction. I'll come back again to this later. And we know very much of the details, not only because of these great books by Professor Hatano or Satomura, but also by reports by local historians. So this is just a very small selection. Basically, almost every prefecture, I think, has this kind of report, the local report in our prefecture. How many Koreans were here? What did they do? How many of them did die? Where do we have memorials? The one on the right, there's a huge series of Korean laborers. And if you don't like to read books, the young folk in the room, maybe you can find this on the internet. This is just one example from Hokkaido, actually, where you have quite a large number of memorials, well, in general. So here is the category list, lots of memorials. And this is the site with memorials dedicated to forced laborers only in Hokkaido. And you have that from all over Japan. So post-war, there was no problem in terms of historiography. There was no discussion to build memorials for the Korean laborers who died in Japan. And even in politics, so this is just one statement from the 1990s. In the Japanese parliament, a member of parliament, Mr. Tsudimura, who basically here refers to history books, which is what I generally recommend when we talk about history, the Kokushi Daijiten, right? And the Kokushi Daijiten is a very authoritative source, right? You wouldn't write stuff in the Kokushi Daijiten that you make up. It's very laudable that you looked at the Kokushi Daijiten and said, oh yeah, there seems to be quite a general understanding of Koreans being forcibly relocated to Japan to forcibly work here, even though, as he says, the methods of recruitment differ from period to period. So even in politics, late 1990s, not very much of a difference. This then also resulted in the memorials that I already mentioned, and these memorials then in the 2000s, however, get contested. And I recently wrote an article about this very low-key monument. Not sure whether anybody is here from Gunma or Takasaki. Even if you are, you probably haven't seen this. It's a monument dedicated to the forced laborers in the prefecture of Gunma. It was built in 2004 in a Kennitsu Koen, in a prefectural park. The prefecture gave the permission to build it. In 2014, however, the prefecture then suddenly decided that the permission would be withdrawn or not extended. The permission was given for 10 years. In 2014, a decision was made to not extend this. In 2021, so there was 8 years of the lawsuit. The first lawsuit was won by the people who built this monument, and the local court said, yes, you can, the prefecture, the administration has to leave the monument. Then there was the Tokyo District Court, which said, no, it has to go. And then people went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, well, this is too minuscule. We don't even want to discuss this, which makes the Tokyo District Court judgment the valid one. So right now, we look at a situation that this monument has to be demolished, or at least removed from the piece of land which belongs to the prefecture. Right, 2014, and the context here is very important, and something that also Rotem already explained. 2014 was a very important year, and it took me also a while to figure out the pieces of the puzzle here. But yeah, I mean, we all know that in 2012, Abe Shinzo became Prime Minister of Japan for the second time, and for the second time, he had a very aggressive revisionist agenda, historical revisionism, I mean, and that included his wish to go to the Yasukuni Shrine, which he did in December 2013. Then he didn't do it anymore. After that, he toned down his historical revisionism a little bit. I'll talk about that later. But in April 2014, the Abe government decided that the terms forced labor and forced relocation shall not be used in Japanese history textbooks, because we don't really know what forced means, which of course is true, right? I mean, as Mr. Tsujimura said, kan asen, boshu, conscription, nobody probably was put in chains in that sense, but there is still a lot of force involved in the recruitment of labor, usually in a wartime society, in any wartime society. So after that, the Sankei Shimbun, which Rotem also quoted, started its by now infamous series Rekshisen, History Wars. It was initiated actually with reference to the comfort women issue. That was the major issue they were kind of working against. But they also had several parts of the series about forced labor in general. And it was against this background that in May 2014, Gunma Prefecture decided to not allow this monument to stand. Actually, in December 2013, the prefectural government administration had decided to extend the permission. They had checked the documents, they had checked everything and said like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with this monument. So we will extend the permission for 10 years. And now we see here a political intervention. The Liberal Democratic Party in the prefectural assembly puts this to a vote and proposes that this monument must go. Although, as you just saw, I mean, it's not very, even you go to that park, you really have to look for it. It's not that it stands out and you go there and like, ooh, wow, there's a menu, there's a monument for forced labor. And it's also, it's not even called Monument for Forced Labor. It's called Memorial, no, it's just called Remembrance, Reflection, and Friendship. Yeah, I'll spare you the details here. It's also worth mentioning the photo on the right. It is it's now in a park, but in that park in the pre-war period, there was an aircraft factory, which you can hardly see even you go there. I have a spider phobia, and it took me really a lot of it was a hard fight to get close enough to take a photograph of the remnants of that factory. It was really a jungle to go there, and then even you can't go closer, right? You see there's a fence, so it's fenced off, but even before the fence, there are like 10 meters of like jungle. And I went there in August when, you know, stuff is growing and spiders are coming out. There's also no explanation, not before 2014, nor now, about the authenticity of this place, saying that we built this memorial here because there was here a site where forced laborers during the war had to work in this factory. So that's very important for sites of memory, that there's a certain authenticity, right? This is given here, and that was also the plan behind building this memorial. But right now we are standing at the situation that we are facing is that it probably has to go. The interesting thing is that legally the prefecture can decide how the space is going to be used, but it cannot just demolish the monument because the monument belongs to somebody, right, as a material entity. So you cannot just take away people's stuff. So there needs to be a compromise in the next years about what to do with that. And the most likely thing is that it will be relocated. Still, it's a very, and it was a very typical and not a very typical development in the 2010s. It was not an exception. So, my next slide. No, right. So in 2014, all over Japan, you could see, Justin has also written about this, that inscriptions were changed, forced labor, or references to comfort were taken out of inscriptions all over Japan. There was definitely a change in historical, in the politics of memory with regards to forced labor and forced relocation in 2014. One interesting difference with Chinese forced labor is that there is no tendency to deny Chinese forced labor. As I had on a previous slide, in the very last 2 years of the war, 1944-45, Japan's situation was so desperate that they did not only relocate people from other parts of the empire, but they also brought about 40 to 50,000 Chinese POWs to Japan to work in factories, construction work, etc. And because these were military, members of the military, POWs, they were registered. So there's no way to deny this. And until today, this is one of the reasons why there is this attack, particularly since 2014, on the issue of forced labor, on Korean forced labor, but not on Chinese forced labor. Another issue, of course, is that the Japanese industry corporations are very much interested in China, right, in general, because they want to make money. So I mentioned Abe Shinzo's visit to Yasukuni Shrine before in 2013. He wanted to visit the shrine every year, but he didn't because in December 2013, the United States complained, not Korea, not China. Mr. Koizumi and others didn't pay much attention to that. But when the US complained in 2013, Mr. Abe stopped going to the Yasukuni Shrine. With regards to China, he has been very careful, he was very careful until the end of his tenure, because Japan needs China as a trading partner, right? And the implicit message here is that Korea is not that important. Obviously, Japan, the government of Japan thinks that it can handle these issues of forced labor and other things more provocatively vis-a-vis Korea than vis-a-vis China, which of course entirely contradicts the current geopolitical approach, right? Japan wants to contain China, the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific, and Japan allying not only with the US, but also with Great Britain, France, and Germany. Germany, a couple of years ago, did send a ship one of its very few ships. Germany isn't really a big naval power, but in order to underline this good relationship with Japan, and in order to contain China, Germany sent a ship to East Asia, and that's called the Indo-Pacific, the strategy of the Indo-Pacific. So in that context, of course, Korea would be a natural partner. And right now we're seeing things going in that direction, with President Yoon and President Kishida being on very good terms. But that was not the approach in the 2010s. And that's why basically all over Japan, memorials to Korean forced laborers have gone. And that even includes some cemeteries. When I travel, including conference travel, I always walk around in town, and in Ghent also there is a war cemetery where you have graves of all kinds of nationalities: Italian soldiers, Russians. I couldn't decipher what they were. Russians, British, of course. There's a corner administered by the Commonwealth War Grave Commission. And so it's very common in Europe to give individuals who died in war a proper burial. That is obviously not the case in Japan, where some of these graves of Korean forced laborers who died in Japan have not given a proper burial. Some of them have been unearthed recently. Probably you have heard about that. And some of the remains have been brought back to Korea. So these issues are still going on, and still many of the remains of Koreans remain buried in very shallow graves all over Japan, near the sites where they did previously work. Yeah, okay, I think my bell is not ringing, but I think this was 15 minutes. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Here. Yeah. No, I don't have a. Okay. I have no images today. So you just be able to hear me. All right. I want to thank my fellow presenters and all of you for coming. I wanted to take two things away from what they said. The first was, and Sven also mentioned this, what Rotem said was saying about what historians do is different than what other people who write about the wars have done. And you'll see how I take that as I go on with my paper. And Sven also pointed out something that I thought was quite important among the many other messages of his talk, was about this idea of Japan wanting to win the war. And this being something that I think is sometimes forgotten. And I just want to think about these things as I do this paper that I presented. So the paper that I'm going to be giving today is part of a new book project, and I'm at its very beginning. And I've long been interested in how social history and international relations interact. And in my first two books, I explored these questions through sex workers and servicemen, and there we see a lot, actually in both of my books, about forced labor and what that might mean. And then my most recent book, which is about Allied POWs in Japanese camps. But the new book project is about the incarceration and internment of people of Japanese descent during World War II. My working title is Life Inside, and hopefully I'll have something better by the next time I give a presentation on this, but that's where I am now. So in the United States, and there's some Americans here, right? We usually encounter this history as something uniquely American, especially now it's something that is very frequently taught in American schools in terms of World War II. And I'm watching this as my daughter goes through the educational system. Americans recall the story of Japanese and Japanese Americans incarcerated on the West Coast as a notorious chapter in US history, where citizens were unfairly denied their rights due to racist misconceptions that questioned their loyalty. And I think that's what we have out there, right? And so one of my goals is to show how what happened in the US is just one part of a bigger and more complex story. In 1941, as a result of decades of overseas settlement and migration, Japanese diplomats, merchants, seamen, farmers, and many others lived on 6 continents, including many countries and colonies under Allied control. With the declaration of war, belligerent lawmakers, sometimes operating under international law, and other times concerned only with local conditions and security considerations, they decided that Japanese subjects, or just those of Japanese ancestry, had to be interned or deported to Japan. Right. Conversely, hundreds of thousands of Allied civilians lived in areas under Japanese control, and some began to be rounded up and put in internment camps. So Washington and London contacted Tokyo via the Swiss, who are their protecting power, concerning the treatment of civilians. This is in 1941, right? Spain is the protecting power for Japan. And the Geneva Conventions protected POWs, but by 1941, the International Committee for the Red Cross and local Red Cross organizations had been unsuccessful in passing similar protections for civilians. And they existed only in draft form. They did exist, but they were in draft form. And so in December 1941, according to diplomatic cables, the Japanese officials agreed to treat civilians according to these proposed ideas on civilians, as long as they didn't contravene Japan's own laws. And the Allies did the same. So one of my main findings in Prisoners of the Empire, which is my most recent book, is that while the Japanese treatment of POWs has long been notorious, that conventional narrative covers up a lot of complexity. And it doesn't actually explain what happened to particular people in particular camps. And so in this new project, I want to begin by asking whether here too, a more nuanced and comprehensive reexamination might reveal critical factors that can better explain the wartime experience. All right, so I'm going to be talking about a particular person today, Toru Yoneoka, who's held in perhaps the most notorious camp in the United States, Tule Lake. His letters and poems didn't omit the most shocking experiences of incarceration. He bore witness to violent events at Tule Lake and reflected on what they said about America and Japan. And his story presents a partial view, to be sure, but considering his experience in Tule Lake does provoke questions that can create a research agenda for exploring captivity worldwide. And I should say right now that so letters that go out of camps are censored, subject to censorship, but poetry is a really nice place to look at this because particularly these short poetry like Tenryu haiku, this is not something that was censored. And so these reflections reveal a complex story. And he identifies as a patriotic Japanese subject and expresses his loyalty to Imperial Japan. And at several points in his letters, he also comments on how good the conditions were in the camp. So for Yoneoka, captivity would mean the opportunity to create an educated life, one filled with poetry and one that would eventually draw him to New York City, where he spent the rest of his days. Yoneoka's letters show how for one would-be poet, captivity provided an opportunity to find a new life. And I should say here, I had it initially in here, but I have access to his letters through his daughter, and I can talk more about that later point. So let's take a look at what I know about his life. He's born in 1901 in Iwakuni City, and at age 15, he travels to Seattle with his father. He remains in the United States when his father returns to Japan 6 years later. He's already a skilled amateur poet by the late 1930s, and his pen name is Nisho. He has his senryu published in the Los Angeles-based Kashu Mainichi Shimbun. But he's working as a laborer. He's working at Marysville, California at D'Antoni Orchards, so not a laborer, I mean a fruit picker. But in 1942, as I mentioned, like approximately 120,000 other persons of Japanese ancestry, Yoneoka is forced to leave his home, and he spends the war years at Tule Lake. So he enters the relocation center in July, bringing 13 pieces of baggage totaling over 500 pounds. And just a little bit about the camp itself, for those of you who don't know, it's built on reclaimed land, and it covered an area of 2 square miles. As he wrote, quote, "Because of the highlands surrounded by mountains, the wind is always blowing. Many captives noted it made the camp very dusty. The temperature could reach 100 degrees, but that's actually cooler than Marysville, and it got even cooler at night. So these places, the internment camps, like in other places and other times, are very distant and from major cities, and often the climate can be very challenging. But Yoneoka's own focus is his education. On November 2nd, 1942, in a letter to his aunt Hironaka, he wrote, "I'm very happy and eager to study here as long as I can go to school free of charge. This may be the last chance for me, so I'm working myself hard." He went to English class, and he works on his poetry, particularly the senryu. He's an amateur poet, as I mentioned, who had already been published, and so he's considered very accomplished through the camp and becomes the president of a senryu group. According to his letters, his first year at Tule Lake was largely concerned with, as I mentioned, the studies, the work, and the poetry. But in mid-1943, Tule Lake's designation as a segregation center brought major changes. It becomes home to approximately 18,000 disloyal people, while the loyal people moved to other camps. His parents and siblings are in Japan, and so he's planning on returning back to Japan. He's hoping to return back to Japan. And so he signs up to return to try and be repatriated. And he's therefore considered disloyal. And he continues to support Imperial Japan. His letters make his views clear. And here's an excerpt from one that he wrote about a ceremony on the emperor's birthday, which was a big celebration at Tule Lake. After the ceremony and after giving a prayer for the Imperial Army, Yoneoka reflected on how the experience of being in the camp increased nationalism among residents. People who visited from other camps, this is a quote, people who visited from other camps were unanimously saying that it was worth it to come to Tule Lake just for this purpose. The Tule Lake relocation camp became like a real Japanese enclave within America. So Yoneoka was conflicted since he was well aware of the privilege of having US citizenship, because he didn't. He hadn't chosen to come to the US, quote, I came to the United States because my father invited me. For me, who was born in Japan, I'm not allowed to become a citizen of the United States. And he continues, I'm one of the enemy aliens under the existing circumstances, and I'm also a man of the disloyal class. And who's already requested leave for home. And as a captive in Tule Lake, forbidden to be repatriated, Yoneoka spent much of his days writing poetry and writing letters. His movement was restricted. He's subject to violence, and Japanese is at times forbidden to speaking of Japanese. But archival records, both the series of letters that he writes, archival records from the Swiss legation and the Spanish consul and a variety of other places don't contain any evidence of inadequate food or shelter. So how can we compare this experience to that of other internees? Because we typically focus on the injustice associated with internment and incarceration, and this is in the United States that I'm talking about now, it can be challenging to think of places like Tule Lake in comparative terms. For the US agencies associated with trying to rescue POWs and internees abroad, maintaining good conditions of the US internment and incarceration camps was important. Of course, what good conditions were is very difficult to answer, particularly in retrospect. At Tule Lake, one visitor, himself a former captive of the Japanese, argued that the War Relocation Association sought to make life at Tule Lake endurable, even as it was criticized by press, the public, and the government. He pointed out, quote, this is war, and they're loyal to Japan, i.e. disloyal to the US. They must of necessity be put in a place where they cannot harm the US. So the 18,000 the people of Japanese descent at Tule Lake were, quote, in a sense, a form of insurance for the safety of some 10,000 American civilians still in the hands of the Japanese. And as US casualty lists grow longer and the war hatred grows more bitter, our treatment of these people will directly affect the treatment of our fellow Americans across the Pacific. And it's this idea, this is the idea of reciprocity, for those of you who are familiar with this, or international law. It's at the heart of the Geneva Conventions. And it was successful for the United States in other binational negotiations. They negotiated with other people together, and not just in the World War II instance, but in other places and times. And Tokyo was aware of and wrote to the US concerning the conditions in Tule Lake and the other internment places, right? But I haven't found a lot of evidence to suggest that this impacted their own treatment of either POWs or civilians. But through the war, there's a multi-part dialogue between the Allies and Japan run through these protecting powers, Switzerland and Sweden, and it continues. The Allies were mostly concerned with the fate of their own service members abroad, but Japanese civilians were resident in most of these places where there were servicemen coming from. But for the most part, this is a history told nationally. From the standpoint of international law, as revealed by the Spanish consul's reports, Yoneoka and the other internees had an analogous experience to internees in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. And so what I want to know is, why is this, or what I'm interested in thinking about more is doing some comparative analysis, understanding why it's so rare, and most importantly, what would putting this camp in an international context reveal, and how could this help us understand this experience? And fortunately for me, there are several new and exciting projects that work transnationally. Just to mention one of them, Jordan Stanger Ross is running one in Canada. It's based in Canada. Maybe some of you are familiar with that or working in it. And I'm a part of some of them, and I should also mention here, I had in my notes to mention earlier, but Rodham co-edited a very important book on internee camps in World War I that has also been very useful to me. But I think it's important for Americans to think about how the United States looks in this larger context, in terms of the camps it constructed, what life inside was like, and what it was like for the people they forced to move there. I'm also interested in to what extent did Tokyo advocate for its subjects, and what did this add? What did this really mean? Is this something that they're just saying, or are they to achieve diplomatic aims, or do they have any interest in the conditions of the people that are living inside these camps? And furthermore, how can considering questions of family and friendship and emigration choices help us understand individual experience? I'm going to wrap up my formal paper here. This is part of a much longer piece, and I have a lot of details on all of these people you should want to know. But just to let you know what happens to Yoneoka, in August 1945, the camps are closing. Yoneoka himself, and this is not uncommon for people who are interned and incarcerated, he moves from California to New York. And he becomes one of the founders of the Manhattan Senryu Ginsha, which is a Senryu organization. He marries, and he gets married, and he has a daughter, Elaine Sayoka Yoneoka, who graduated from my high school and came to give a talk and attended it during COVID, during the main part of COVID. We gave book talks over COVID, and so, or at least I did. And she came, and then she says to me, "Would you be interested in reading my father's letters? I can't read them, and I think we should tell a story." So that was, so that's one of the places that this book came from, and so I'm thankful to her as well. And thank you for listening.
Okay, any questions? Yeah, well, 1, 2, 3. We might have some simple questions. Okay. So let's not see how that goes.
Are there some questions?
What are you?
Are there student questions?
Thank you for sharing the story about Gunma and Monumental. It's very interesting. We want to go there. The question is, how much is related to the position of local government? Because we have the figure of Yamamoto, the governor, who was extremely active in this entire Korean. I mean, he actually invested into this kind of field. Then he was the Abbas office, right? So, and have you ever heard about the Utoro village in Uji?
Yeah.
And that could be a successful example. Of course, they have a community over there. So that's why. So, what is the local factor in these kind of events? And for Rodham, you mentioned that there was no capital in Shanghai. So what is your take on Hankou? I know if you speak about capital, I mean, it doesn't, couldn't be compared with the Nazis one. But if we speak about, I don't know, Middle Ages Europe, there was like a certain kind of capital, right? So some historians actually use it. So what is your take on it? And well, it's just a comment. You might be interested in going to, have ever been to Tsuruga Memorial? They have, right? So they have quite a successful local story. So it's not like up-down kind of thing in Japan. They maintain it to create some channels with Lithuania, right? Poland, and so maybe you have some comments on it. That's all for me. Thank you very much.
Excuse me, if I just may, it would be nice if the answers could be directed to the camera, because the microphone is also here. And for everybody in the room who has a question, please speak up as loudly as you can so that the online audience also will hear your question.
Thank you. Yeah. So the question was about the local situation in Gunma and the governor of Gunma Prefecture, Yamamoto Ichita. Yeah. So. I mean, we have two sides, or even three sides involved here. One is those people who proposed the monument, and they would be a local grassroots group of citizens, local historians, and also some former Zainichi Koreans would be involved. When they proposed this memorial in 2004, there was a little bit back and forth about the naming. So as I said, the name is Friendship, Reconciliation, and Reflection, something like that. It was supposed to be called a memorial to memorize the forced laborers. And the prefecture said, well, maybe you want to reconsider that. And that was the compromise reached. And then you have the second player, which is the administration. And I guess all of you have had to do with Japanese administration previously, right? They're very correct, and they're very unpolitical most of the time. And they were, which is why they approved of the monument. And in 2004, even the prefectural assembly approved of this monument unanimously in 2004. In 2014, as I said, the prefecture, the administration again said, yeah, there's nothing wrong with this monument, and we're going to extend the permission. And then it was, Yamamoto did not play a leading role in that. He tried to keep a low profile, and he is not, he's also a member of the Nippon Kaigi, of course, like everybody is in the LDP, almost everybody, but he is not a leading historical revisionist, I would say. And he tried to keep a low profile in this case. But in the prefectural assembly in 2014, the extension was denied unanimously. So you have unanimously approval, and then 10 years later, unanimously denying. So obviously, there is something going on. Prime Minister Abe, of course, committing to historical revisionism, the Sankei Shimbun, starting this Rekishisen series. So in 2014, obviously, particularly with the question of forced labor from Korea, that was something that was going around, and people in the prefectural assembly, I don't know whether they were told to vote against it, or whether that was just in the air, like, reading the air. Sorry?
Within the party course.
Yeah, but even, I think it was unanimously, which I don't remember the exact composition of the prefectural assembly in 2014. I mean, it would be quite weird if Socialist Party, Social Democratic Party, or Communist Party would vote against that. Anyway, so these would be the actors, and these are still the actors fighting. So there was this citizens group. It was called a citizen group to erect the monument. Now it's called the citizens group to protect the monument, and they have been dealing with these lawsuits, and now they deal with the negotiations with the prefecture to find a solution what to do about it. Sorry, I better keep it short because we have plenty of questions.
So, about the Hanko designated area, or is it referred to as a ghetto? I would start with a statement that I wouldn't mind any use of this small episode, really minor episode of rescuing, saving, or just offering, granting visa, if there was a kind of anything true about it. But the problem is that most of it is, in fact, the story is exactly the opposite. I mean, if you remember, in 1992, United States offered an apology and a small amount of money for all those who were detained. In fact, the story of Jews in East Asia is exactly the same. They were detained in the same way the American Japanese were. Some of them for 2.5 years, some of them in Indonesia for a little longer, and other places. In fact, the entire treatment was abysmal, was very problematic. And instead, today, there are constantly children and grandchildren of so-called survivors, Sugiha survivors, Holocaust survivors, Sugiha survivors, sounds strange, who are brought to Japan, and they are offering gratitude to Japanese authority for saving their ancestor. Look how it was, instead of an apology, we are now supposed to say thank you for this kind of help during World War II. So this is completely subversion of history. Now, talking about the Hanko designated area, this 2.5 years are, in fact, in February 1943 until the summer 1945 are stuck there. Truly, there were no any execution, fortunately, and some of them were even could go out for work. But in fact, there was no any reason they would be there. In fact, the enemy was Chinese, not German Jews who came there just as refugees. So the entire treatment is unclear. In recent exchange with the editor in Sankei Shimbun, said, what do you want? We protected them there. So that was for their protection. Against who exactly, it's unclear. So the story is the issue is not there's these days tens of books about the theater there and about the relation with Chinese. If anyone is using the story, But the main question is why were they detained at the first place, in that place? About Tsuruga, it's quite interesting. In fact, all these refugees, about 2,000, were brought to Tsuruga from Vladivostok or Nakhotka, and had there about 1 hour. Some members of the Kobe community were waiting for them. Often they were waiting for half an hour, 1 hour, and moved to Kobe. These days, there is an entire story, communal story in the last 15 years around they were offered, some of them were offered an apple. So there is now apples of Tsuruga as a kind of a trademark of and then recently there's a story that one of them had a bus. So I was invited to give a lecture in front of the city, in the city hall about Jewish bathing customs. Of course, I declined, but that was my invitation. So the whole story now getting a completely strange form about nothing, about just a few minutes passing from the port to the train station and then moving. Now, in a sense, this is very positive development. I mean, emphasizing humanism, Jim Dono, or whatever. But at the same time, and in some place, I don't see any new attitude toward asylum seekers, and I haven't seen so many Syrian, Afghanistan, or Afghanian, or any other refugees except to Japan. So exactly what is the meaning of all this humanism? Ukrainians, there were about 5 or something.
A bit more.
A bit more.
Yeah.
But well, there is I wonder about the connection, but probably with another line of anti-Russian, whatever. But still, I haven't seen any change in, and I would like to, if it wouldn't been there, I would say, okay, let's use it as a platform for a new stage in attitude to the world and attitude to, but I haven't seen it, so, and I'm still looking forward. Thanks.
Should we have maybe 2 more questions and very short answer? Can we go a little bit over time?
I will be very good next time.
Okay. Yes, no?
The conveners of the next panels are already here, so I think it's partly due to them. I think you can go like 5 to a maximum of 10 minutes over
Okay.
time.
Yeah, so I've got the order, please, yeah.
I had a couple of thoughts and in respond or not, I'll get them up quickly, but we were reflecting on certain connections in books. I'm remembering, you probably do too, in the late 80s and early 90s, you could walk into a Japanese bookstore and you would find Yuda poems. And you would find in that everything from, Sugihara wasn't a hero yet, but you'd find, I don't know, the Doso run, the Japanese and the usual Jews originated in the same mythical figure. And then right next to it, you find a translation of the protocols of the other two kinds. And the Japanese, of course, didn't know the difference. Then that disappeared, thankfully. But when I was listening to Ben's talk, I'm thinking, the words as well, I think. We have the same problem. I've lived in Canada a long time, but I am a recovering American for the rest of my life. It's something in the chi in the universe these days. But if you want to find chains, you go to the United States and you find how slavery is now being reinterpreted as in the South, at least, in this insane way. And I don't know what's going on, but maybe you had some thoughts.
I don't know exactly what's going on, but I have to say, it's not only the US. In Britain now, we also have this attack on academic history by politicians saying, well, anyone else that after all. So yeah, there's something going on. And of course, it's not a very new development, it's been a back and forth, but right now there's a very strong political development in many countries against the dictating on achievements of academic history. And that is one. Anybody else who wanted to ask? Oh, yeah, somebody else. Yeah, we had several hands here, so maybe we stay. Sorry, Marcos. Maybe Marcos, you can type your question.
Could you maybe come more and speak into the mic? Marcos.
Oh, okay. Okay. Justin, you want to? Yeah. Please.
I just wanted to, let's say, thanks and then ask Sarah a question. I don't know that much about internment camps in the US actually. I just read a little bit about Japanese immigrants in the pre-war to Brazil. And it's really interesting to look at their experiences. I'm wondering how that might compare to Japanese immigrants to the US living in the US at that time. For instance, a lot of immigrants wanted to return to Japan. Eventually, actually, they wanted to work in Brazil for a while, then return to Japan. And so how much did that exist in the US case, for example? And then they felt a lot of times abandoned by Japan as well. Throughout as the war progressed, basically. And then when the war ended, like, well, they're not going to repatriate to something. So if that existed, and then did any Japanese residents in the US refuse to believe that Japan lost the war as well, because that occurred in some instances elsewhere in Brazil, for example.
So just very quickly, I didn't get a chance to talk about Latin America and the US, and as you probably know, the experience of Japanese in Latin America during the Second World War is like very different. But one thing that happens is that we see according to US, many of them are moved to internment and incarceration camps in the United States. Others, like in Peru, lose their citizenship. So that's kind of, I don't think I really, but they are actually experiencing many of the same things that he is. I haven't seen that yet. That doesn't mean that exists. Any evidence that people didn't realize the war. As your last question, I'll just end there because we don't have much time, but I'm happy to discuss.